Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, when Hallie was reading the Torah this morning, she stopped just before the bit where I want to begin, so thank you for the intro. There's a very unusual piece of typography in this morning's Torah portion. It doesn't occur anywhere else in the Torah. It only occurs in one other place in the Tanakh. And I want to frame my remarks around that. So the children of Israel, if you were reading along in the Torah portion, you would know, have just resumed their journeys through the desert. And we find two verses surrounded by this unusual piece of typography. Now, we know what these two verses are. The first one says, when the ark was to set out, Moses would say, he wouldn't cough first probably, "Arise, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered and may your foes flee before you." And when it halted, second verse, and when it halted, he would say, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." Now, in Hebrew, those verses are, "Vayehi ben soa ha'aron, vayomer Moshe, kuma Adonai vayafutzu oyevecha vayanusu mesanecha mipanecha." That's the first one. And the second one is the one that we just now sang, "Uvnocho yomar, shuva Adonai rivavot alfei Yisrael." And if you look at a Torah scroll, and Hallie, you will have seen this morning when you were reading, floating one before the verses and one after them are two rather strange versions of the Hebrew letter Nun. And it depends on which Torah scroll you're reading as to exactly what these letters are doing. Sometimes they're floating there upside down and back to front. Sometimes they float on their sides. And in Sephardi Torah scrolls, I only learned this week, they float with one of their little nun legs twisted over the other as if they've got their legs crossed. And they look kind of like what I would call a letter Z and what you would call a Z. And nobody really knows why those letters are there. And you can imagine that the tradition has a field day with this. Our rabbis love to explain the inexplicable. So, for example, you have a teaching that these special markings mean that the bit in between those two verses that we began with is actually a whole separate book of the Torah. Those two verses, 85 Hebrew words, comprise a whole book of the Torah, which is cool if you think about the fact that that would then give us a 7-book Torah, and we Jews like things that come in groups of 7. There's another teaching that says those are the first two verses of a separate book, the rest of which was not regarded as appropriate for public consumption and was hidden away. And there's a third teaching that says that those signs are there to say that those two verses really don't belong where they are in the Torah. It's a kind of sign that there's been a cut and paste. The difficulty with that teaching is that we don't know where they do belong, and the rabbis resolve that by saying, well, when the Messiah comes, one of the things that we're going to ask him is where we put those verses in the Torah, and they will eventually find their place. And the Zohar, this I loved, the Zohar sees them as symbols of the Shekhinah, of God's presence guarding the camp of the Israelites in front and behind. And they see those nuns, which for people who knew the Zohar, Sephardim, they would have seen them in that Z shape. And in that shape, they see the figure of a gazelle looking over its shoulder, a gazelle being one of the earthly manifestations of God's presence. So there's a lot of ground to be dug there, and a lot of academics have written about this as well. But to me, the blindingly obvious thing about this typography is that it draws attention to the two verses that it surrounds. So it would seem that what we need to be doing is looking more closely at those two verses. So let me give them to you again. The first of the two verses is, when the ark was to set out, Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered, and may your foes flee before you." And the second of those verses is, "And when it halted, he, Moses, would say, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." So if we want to look for the message in those words, the most obvious thing is to look at the immediate context. And what's been happening in the Torah is that from the middle of the book of Exodus, give or take, to that moment, the children of Israel have not moved anywhere. They've been stationary at the bottom of Mount Sinai. And those two verses happen just around the time that they get into formation and begin to march again. And the Torah tells us that every time from now on they're going to break camp and move, the first of these verses, "Arise, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered," is going to be said by Moses to start them off. And the second one, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands," is going to be said when they make camp once again. In which case, I want to suggest that these two verses must have something important to teach us about journeys, about what it is to be on a journey, about what it is to set out, and what it is to return once again. And hidden in those verses, I want to suggest, if we interpret them, are the answers to the questions, how do I set out on a journey? And how should I arrive at the other end? Now, of course, there are many kinds of journey. There's the physical journey that the children of Israel are taking in the Torah portion. But we also know that a journey is itself a very fertile metaphor. And that there are figurative or metaphorical journeys that we take as well. For example, Hallie today is taking the first step on her journey to being a Jewish adult, having been, up until now, a Jewish child. And if we think about it that way, I think that each of us should be able to identify, if we just take a moment, a journey that we are on. We're obviously all of us on the human journey, the one that is expressed as being from the cradle to the grave as we sit here this morning. But each of us individually might be making other journeys. Maybe we are making the journey into our summer vacation. Maybe, and more seriously, we are journeying through a sickness. Maybe we are journeying, maybe we are beginning, or we are on the journey of mourning as it's set out in the Jewish tradition. Maybe we're on our way to a new school. Maybe we're on our way to a new job. If we focus, we can each identify a journey that we are on. And if that is the case, I invite us to hold that journey in our minds and see how the teachings of the Torah, these two verses, can apply to it, and whether it gives us anything to take, as it were, along the way. So we look again at the first verse. When the ark was to set out, Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered and may your foes flee before you." Out of everything that could conceivably be said at the beginning of a journey that Moses has to choose from, why does he choose this? What is the emotion that is underpinning these words? And I want to suggest that they are prompted first and foremost by fear. By fear. When I was a young child myself, I used to run a fever anytime my family drove more than about 10 miles from home. And before a family vacation, it used to run particularly high. My mother would stick the thermometer in my mouth, and I'd be registering over 100. And a number of family vacations got cancelled as a result of my running this fever, or as in England we called it, a temperature, until my parents realized that if they just wrapped me in a blanket and stuck me on the back seat of the car and drove to wherever it was they were going to, I would be fine once we got there. And indeed I was. And indeed my body still clears fevers very quickly, even as an adult. But the reason that I brought this morning is to say that clearly it was something about the disruption and the anticipation of the journey that was translating itself into a heightened experience in my little girl body. And journeys are scary. Journeys are scary because they mean that we abandon the familiar. We leave behind what we know and what we trust and what is real to us and what is safe, and we launch ourselves into the dangerous, unknown, liminal territory that lies outside our immediate realm of familiarity. We commit ourselves to the wilderness, and we know that the wilderness is an important place in the Torah and an important place in tradition. And as our congregant Stephen Tobolowsky, sitting in the back there, put it in his latest movie called The Primary Instinct, which I was fortunate enough to see a showing of this week. When this came up, I actually wrote it down and thought, this is going in the sermon. He said, and I quote, "A story is a journey. It takes us from one place to another, and we are changed by that journey. And the important thing is that the listener has to be changed too." So somewhere inside us, we understand that going on a journey means that we're never going to be the same again. And I think it is that fear, not of the journey itself, although they're scary, but the fear of change that prompts Moses to call on God to clear the way at the beginning of the journey. And we should notice, by the way, that Moses doesn't call on God to arise and be there at the end of the journey. No. Moses calls on God to make the journey with the children of Israel, blowing up the bumps on the road that are going to come up, and accompanying them every step of the way to their destination. And so the lesson would be for us on the journey that we identified, that we should not make that journey alone, but we should be calling on our guardians to help us. And we can ask, who are the ones who guard us when we are on our figurative journeys? What is the strength that we call on when we're in transition? How do we keep it with us as we make that transition? Hallie, we know that one of your guardians is Ariana Grande, and that when we spoke, it became clear that she works for you really in that way. Moses calls on God, or what Moses believes to be God. Who are our guardians? The children of Israel have a pillar of cloud in the day and this fire-like substance by night. But what is protecting us as we close the door behind us, literally or figuratively, and set out towards the new? In that first verse, the lesson the Torah is teaching us is that nobody has to travel alone. And it invites us to identify our guardians and invoke their protection. And at the other end of the journey, Moses invites God, who has been traveling with them, back in. Moses invites God to settle. Here's the verse. When it halted, he would say, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel." And I think there are two lessons here. The first is that even God has to come back. The journey has meant that God, or our guardian, or whatever we perceive of as that energy that has sustained us, that has taken a journey too and has to arrive properly at the destination. Maybe we could even say that a journey changes God as much as it changes us. And certainly for those of us who have been on figurative, difficult journeys, through illness, through mourning, know that during that journey, our understanding of God, our relationship with God, is going to be changed. And perhaps this is why we have the tradition when we arrive in a new place, we Jews, of putting a mezuzah up on the doorpost. It really is as if to give a message that says, okay, God, you can live here now. And the other message, the 10,000 thousands. Why 10,000 thousands? Rivavot Alfei Yisrael. I believe it doesn't occur anywhere else in the Torah. Why so many? To teach us that There are 10,000 waiting for us at the end of our journey. If you think about the moment that you first arrive in a new place, perhaps the first day of a new school, you don't really know anybody. You might know nobody at all. It's impossible to believe that all of these strangers will one day somehow become familiar. But the Torah is teaching us that each new face that we encounter at the end of the journey is one of the 10,000 thousands within which the ark will rest, and we will be safe, at least until the start of the next journey, because for we human beings, we're on journeys all the time. So the lesson of the inverted nuns, the lesson that the Torah really wants us to notice, these two verses, the take-home, if you want, is that whatever journey we are on, whatever journey we identified, we're not traveling alone. We may be fearful when we set out. We may dread the changes that are coming, but we are never outcast. We are never abandoned, and even in the wilderness, we don't wander on our own. We take our guardians with us. We may call them God, we may call them inspiration, we may call them memory, but whatever it is, we take them with us. And when we settle into our new reality, we are already surrounded by the 10,000 thousands we have yet to greet, but who, in a way, we have already met. I wish us safe and meaningful travels to our respective destinations. Shabbat Shalom.